reference to any particular work done in evaluation. So I want to sort of follow that.
What do you mean evaluate? I don't understand.
So there's no by the witness.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then there's no record by record analysis, nothing like that in there. So I would just ask that the court, I think Dr. Sylvain first, if I have a review for the court to have that report.
Anything you want to say, Mr. Mayor?
I'm aware of the court's order from October. The interview with Mr. Heidel and Mr. Johnson incorporates the information that also solicits from Dr. Ha. He was the witness that we specifically informed the court and the prosecution would be discussing the specifics of different dogs. And we informed the prosecution in our disclosure summary that he had reviewed the work done by particular dogs and the specific training of these particular dogs. He's read many thousands of pages of discovery. At the hearing in June of 2019, the information that had been provided was that Dr. Cable was going to, he testified, was going to give information generally about working dogs, human remains detection dogs, and that Dr. Ha had reviewed the specifics and provided information about the specifics. And that's what he's going to provide.
So was there ever any report provided for it? That was an issue, and that didn't happen at this point.
There was not, but there was compliance with the court's order. We provided a summary, and then Your Honor issued an order saying that if it was discussed by Mr. Heidel and Mr. Johnson with Dr. Ha, that information discussed in that interview would be fair game for direct examination. So the specifics and the work that was done by these particular handlers is information we seek to elicit from Dr. Ha. He has listened to the testimony of Karen Corcoran-Gumman and Ray Randolph, and we'd offer him to rebut that information as well. Mr. Johnson has been on notice. That's the reason that we're calling Dr. Ha, is to challenge the evidence presented by those two particular witnesses, and we actually included Katie Steelman because the good faith witness list provided by the prosecution indicated that she would be called to provide information. So we also included in our discussions with them and disclosure that Katie Steelman would be one of the witnesses that he was offering specifics about. Obviously, we don't need to do that, but there's no surprise here. So it's both rebuttal will be consistent with the disclosure provided, the summary disclosure, and the interview counsel did with Dr. Ha.
Yes, sir. So that's helpful context, not just outlining the timeline of the summary written by that's why I like for it. That's when we did our and that's when what for Dr. Malawat's testimony was that after the report was released, Dr. Ha had that time. So that's why I made the fact that you need to report on it to see what the record. Now Mr. Moran is pointing out that he said that I have no idea what he said. So I tried my best 9 months ago to raise Dr. Ha provided support. Different route, and that's fine. The court order to be clear, not only home access that I had to Dr. Ha. And the other thing I would note, Judge, is my read something back then as well, and I'll be relying upon that. I asked for updates. I appreciate counsel for this testimony, for example, but I have that time to talk about it. So we requested, the court ordered it, and I just provided that to the court.
I'll take a look at this probably in lunch hour. My initial thought without looking at it with the change is that Dr. Ha is ability to go in the report, specifically what I'm thinking is that I won't let him testify about any record disease within the report, which I think was it. However, I think he can certainly comment on just like any expert witness could, and what their conclusions were.
Your Honor, that's probably sufficient, but I think that it's
We're not arguing about it. I'm just saying that's what I think. It's a few days to have an idea of what's come back.
And you know, obviously, information elicited by the prosecution on direct is information that there would be on notice that we would seek to rebut. That's what we'll do with Dr. Ha. But Dr. Ha was giving his assessment of the type of training that Ms. Randolph's dog and Ms. Corcoran Gunning's dogs had undergone, and how the training that they had done did not allow them the capacity in the case of Ms. Corcoran Gunning to sense residual lingering odor, and that was something that they've certainly been on notice on. I mean, we've had multiple hearings and pleadings filed on the issue.
There may be no source that we can know, so I'm not going to argue. I appreciate you guys letting me know what your positions are. We will take care of it.
Not on this issue. There's two more issues.
Right. That's what I meant.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Your Honor. We anticipate calling. We are going to call Dr. Phil Danielson as the first witness this morning. Like the people yesterday, sought a limiting motion in limine regarding what we could cross Ms. Randolph on. I'm doing a similar motion this morning. I'm seeking an order from the court not permitting the prosecution to cross-examine or introduce evidence during Mr. Danielson's testimony regarding two items. One, the Dixon order from U.S. v. Tourney, and two, the Tourney report from the Texas Forensic Sciences Commission. Basically, the backstory here is, Judge, that in 2015, Dr. Danielson testified as an expert at some pretrial hearings in, I think, the District Court of Washington, D.C., regarding the procedures followed by a private lab, NMS Lab. And he was in a consultant role with NMS Labs, and he discussed their procedures in some findings that they made regarding a second independent analysis of DNA that contradicted the prosecution's DNA case in that matter. What was in play in that case were issues of split peaks, saturation, overamplification. None of those issues are in play in Mr. Redwine's case. By the same token, there was no independent analysis of any swabs or anything by Dr. Danielson in this case. So I think that the order from Judge Dixon is not material to what he will be testifying about today. And though Judge Dixon in the D.C. Circuit listened to Dr. Danielson's expert testimony, he did not credit it in his final order. However, after that order came out, another analysis by an independent entity was done of NMS Labs that coincided with and supported Dr. Danielson's testimony in those proceedings. The other report that came out of those proceedings, like I said, was the Tourney report by the Texas Forensic Sciences Commission. That report has a specific limitation in its opening pages. It's a 40-page document, but it specifically says the Commission's authority contains important statutory limitations. For example, no finding by the Commission constitutes a comment upon the guilt or innocence of any individual. The Commission's written reports are not admissible in civil or criminal actions. And after that report was drafted, one of the architects of that report was then relieved from her duties with Texas Forensic Sciences Commission. As the court can tell, there's a lot of moving parts in both the Texas Commission report and Judge Dixon's order, none of which are material in Dr. Danielson's analysis and review of the CBI data and conclusions in this case, as his testimony in this case flows entirely from data, reports, raw data that's been provided to him from CBI. So I would ask the court to not permit the introduction of either that order or commission report or cross-examination of that while Dr. Danielson speaks. I think the people are going to have a reply to that. I would ask to respond to that briefly.
Well, they'll have a response. You can reply. Mr. Johnson, or Mr. Doherty.
Good morning, Your Honor. Thank you. Your Honor, counsel is absolutely right that this goes directly to Dr. Danielson's qualifications. And in fact, when this comes up in other cases with respect to counsel, it's usually litigated by the defense in advance of trial. And the court's being put in a very difficult and I would say unfair position in having to decide this on the spot today when we have a jury waiting downstairs. It goes to the question that the court's going to be asked, the request the defense is going to have for you in just a few minutes, which is to qualify Dr. Danielson as an expert in DNA analysis and DNA interpretation. That 2015 order from Judge Dixon stated Dr. Danielson's testimony is not to be credited. His position that casework can be interpreted differently than validation samples is incomprehensible and out of step with accepted principles within the forensic DNA field. The court went on to say that the NMS lab's application, the methodology and interpretation of the data, which is exactly what counsel is offering Dr. Danielson for in this case, the interpretation of data, was not conducted in accordance with the accepted practices of the DNA community. That was the order of the court from Judge Dixon in 2015. Then the Texas Commission takes an independent look at it in 2018 and determines that there were several issues with Dr. Danielson's testimony, that his credibility was significantly undermined in the area of DNA interpretation, and that the work of the analysts at NMS was unreliable. In response, Your Honor, let me take one quick step back here. In Dr. Danielson's CV, in this case, he shares that he's a scientific advisor with NMS Labs. In response to the Texas Commission finding in 2018, NMS Labs announced and assured the Texas Commission Dr. Danielson's no longer going to be doing this work for NMS Labs. This goes to the heart of his credibility. It's the direct issue that counsel is going to ask him to be qualified on. It would be misleading to the jury. It would be incredibly misleading to this jury for Dr. Phil Danielson to take the stand and talk about DNA interpretation and to give his expert opinion without the court allowing the people to inquire on other court decisions, the Texas Commission, and the announcement from NMS Labs that he had these credibility issues, wrongly interpreted the data, and testified in such an egregious manner that a court, an independent commission, and NMS Labs all took action against Dr. Danielson. This should have been litigated in advance, but what I've just said, I think succinctly summarizes exactly why this is directly relevant to his qualifications as a proposed expert in this case.
So is it your position that he should not be qualified? And I know I'm not making a decision now, but that's your position. Or that you can cross-examine on those two items, depending whether or not I qualify or not?
Arguably, he should not be qualified. In fairness to the defense, and to make sure the defense has an opportunity to present the full case, I would allow, that the people would allow him to be qualified as an expert in DNA interpretation, provided the jury is allowed to hear this information. It goes directly to the heart of his qualifications and how reliable his testimony and opinion is.
Your Honor, Dr. Danielson has testified several times as a qualified expert in Colorado and outside of Colorado since the 2015 decision by Judge Dixon. And quite frankly, there's going to be different interpretations and opinions about what the facts were in the Dixon order and what happened thereafter in Texas. But he's been qualified actually in this courtroom, in this jurisdiction, and this issue's been brought up before in another case. So he's eminently qualified, and certainly this one order that speaks to issues that are not in play whatsoever in this case doesn't disqualify him.
Okay, but that's what I'm thinking, that it doesn't disqualify him. But I think that it certainly charges the prosecution.
I think it depends on the mode of cross-examination, because the introduction of the order as evidence or the Texas Forensic Commission report would both be hearsay and would be extrinsic evidence, which is not permitted under Colorado Rule of Evidence 608.
If the jury can't make the determination as to his reliability based upon this history, why should I admit him then?
Because he's eminently qualified in DNA analysis, serology, statistics, Judge.
But I'm the gatekeeper as to whether or not there's reliability. There's been a finding by, and I haven't read any of this. This is catching me cold, and I am not happy to have this just before he testifies, because it is unfair to the court. It's just inviting error. It's something that should have been litigated beforehand, and even if we found out about this last week, we could have been dealing with this. So that is poor form at a minimum. At a minimum. And I lost what you just told me. So I'm sorry. What did you say?
You were asking me why he should be qualified if I'm arguing to the court that introducing the judge's order and the report as extrinsic evidence. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I understand the extrinsic evidence argument.
Right.
But it doesn't mean they can't cross-examine him on it. But if I got to think about this. I don't know. Because if you're, I mean, I know the rule talks about extrinsic evidence. You're kind of stuck with what somebody says. But if I remember correctly, and I haven't looked at it for a while, extrinsic evidence is kind of to a collateral matter. Is that the way the rule reads? It's my memory, but I haven't looked at it for a while. I don't see this being a collateral matter.
Colorado Rule 608, Section B, specific instances of conduct. Specific instances of conduct of a witness for the purpose of attacking or supporting the witness's character for truthfulness other than a conviction of a crime provided in another statute may not be proved by extrinsic evidence. They may, however, in the discretion of the court, if probative of truthfulness or untruthfulness, be inquired to upon cross-examination of the witness. One, concerning the witness's character for truthfulness or untruthfulness, or two, concerning the character for truthfulness or untruthfulness of another witness, which I don't think is important.
Anything you want to say, Mr. Gordy?
Your Honor, I would say on that point that I presume counsel is about to call Dr. Danielson and go through a whole list of qualifications and also have him talk about the fact that he's been qualified as an expert previously, and to leave out the times where the court has found him to not be credible in DNA interpretation, and the action taken by NMS Labs is just a complete and unfair omission and also absolutely misleading to the jury when they're trying to assess his reliability.
Well, and I guess the other thing is this really a specific instance of conduct? I mean, in one sense it is, because this is his testimony and what he did. But in another sense, it's findings by independent people that he didn't comply with the underlying standards, which I think the jury should be able to hear. So I'm not sure that it's really a specific instance of conduct in terms of this rule. I think it would be helpful if I could see the opinion and the report, and it would be helpful if we didn't call him this morning so that I can have a chance to look at that.
By all means, Judge.
Okay. And does somebody have those things that I can review, and we'll make them part of the record?
Yes, Your Honor.
I can provide them digitally.
Well, I don't care how they get provided. Just email them to me this morning. Do you have any other people that you could go forward with?
We can probably have someone here in like 15, 20 minutes, Judge.
All right. That's fine. Anything else you want to say about this?
Not at this time, Your Honor, except I just want to be clear, counsel is going to be sending the court the order from the Dixon case and the findings of the Texas Commission. Is that what the court is requesting?
That's what I'm requesting.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. The reason I ask this is because in the Texas Commission findings, there's a number of things in the appendix, and I would just ask that the NMS response to the Texas Commission, in which they explain that Dr. Danielson will no longer be doing this work for them, although he lists himself as a science advisor in the CV for this case for NMS, that also be provided to the court.
All right.
I'll provide what I have and make sure you.
Well, you provide what you have. You take a look at it. If there's something else I need to see, that's fine.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. While we have this break, I guess, I do want want to go over Curtis, Mr. Redwine, it's just you don't have to make any decisions today. I do want to explain to you your right to testify. I'm sure you've already talked to your attorneys about it, but I need to inquire of you one time. So, you need to understand that you do have a right to testify, and if you want to testify, no one can prevent you from doing so. I can't stop it, your attorneys can't stop it, it's entirely your decision as to whether or not you testify. If you do testify, the prosecution of the proceeding will be allowed to ask you questions. I don't think you have any criminal convictions, but if you did, or felony convictions, excuse me, but if you did, those could be used to try to impeach your credibility, to make it look like you were lying, and those could be disclosed to the jury. The witnesses, the jury will also be allowed a chance to ask you questions as you've seen that process. If we do disclose that there's a felony conviction, the jury would be instructed that it be considered only as it bears upon your credibility. You also have a right not to testify. If you decide not to testify, the jury will be instructed about that right and that they cannot draw any inference of guilt from the fact that you did not testify. Again, this is solely your decision. It's not your attorney's, but your attorneys know a lot more about trials than you do, and they're representing you for a reason. I would expect you to consult with them, consider what their advice is before you make your decision, but you handle it how you want. Okay? So with that, I guess we'll be in recess for a little while. Let us know when you've got a witness available.
By all means. I did. Okay. I mean, they're big files, so hopefully they go.
Well, I'm just going to print them. I'm sorry, you guys don't have to stand. I'm sorry. I forget sometimes. Thank you. Yeah, probably. Come on in. Everybody rise for the jury class? Yeah, that was nice. All right, we can be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for getting here. I know you were ready before 8 o'clock, but we weren't. So I'm sorry about that. Things come up in trials, sometimes causing delays. Sometimes they're beyond anybody's fault. And we had a delay today. So with that, first defense witness.
Defense respectfully calls Dr. Bruce Anderson.
I got other stuff. Dr. Anderson, come on up to the witness stand, please. And before you sit down, if you'd raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear? Yeah, to me first. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Have a seat. Good morning, Judge. Good morning.
May it please the court. Doctor, could you state and spell your name for the record, please?
Bruce Edward Anderson, Anderson.
And briefly, what do you do for a living these days?
I'm a forensic anthropologist for a county medical examiner in Arizona.
Which county?
Pima County. Tucson is the largest city.
And I want to come back and talk about some of the work you do there in a moment, but can you give the jury a general overview of what your responsibilities and duties are as the forensic anthropologist for the medical examiner in Pima County, Arizona?
For the past 21 years, I've done a forensic anthropology exam at the request of a pathologist who completed an autopsy and wanted some further information. Everything from flesh bodies, whether or not there's some trauma or identification was in question, to skeletal remains to where the pathologist is limited to what he or she can do with those bones. And then they would turn the case over to me to glean as much information as they could.
And what's the mission of the medical examiner of Pima County?
Sorry?
What does the medical examiner's office do in Pima County? What is their mission?
We're tasked statewide to perform post-mortem investigations and sometimes examinations, which means autopsy or an external examination of the body for unnatural deaths, and then deaths that could be natural, but there's some question. So I think it's about 2 or 5% of the deaths that occur statewide, and we cover 11. We do autopsies for 11 of the 15 counties in Arizona, so it's more than just Pima County. But about 2 to 5%, I believe, of deaths are investigated by our office. There's not always an autopsy. Sometimes the body isn't even brought in, but our investigators do some kind of investigation to make sure it is a natural death and there's nothing the family or law enforcement needs to worry about.
And briefly, does that work at the medical examiner's office include field work, going to scenes where bodies are, and does it include lab work?
Mostly laboratory work. We do go out and exhume clandestine graves, sometimes help law enforcement look for scattered bones after they find a human bone and then they suspect animals or some other agent move bones around. But that's a minority of what I do. Most of what I do, 50 hours a week, 45 to 50 hours a week, Monday through Friday, is inside the anthropology lab.
And can you recite for the court and the jury what your education is in this field of forensic anthropology and anthropology?
I have a doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Arizona. Prior to that, I received a master's degree in forensic anthropology at the University of Arizona. I've been doing this kind of work for 36 years. I'm board certified by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. There's about 150 of us that have that certification, 150 in the United States with that certification. I was a founding member of what's called the Scientific Working Group in Forensic Anthropology. Excuse me.
And I think you can help yourself to a bottle of water there.
Which about 10, 12 years ago, 12 of us got together to try to hammer out about 20 standards for our field. So everybody that's called themselves a forensic anthropologist kind of met first the minimum requirements and then exercise best practices. I was a anthropologist for the NAMUS project. That's our national missing and unidentified persons system. It's a DOJ-funded missing persons and deceased database where all missing people descriptions and all decedent descriptions are in one central database. And I guess that's about it.
And as far as your studies in anthropology, your degrees, do you have any specializations, say, besides forensic anthropology?
No, I would say I'm a forensic anthropologist. Most forensic anthropologists are physical anthropologists, and most physical anthropologists know a lot about the skeleton, the human skeleton especially, more than medical doctors do, which is why forensic pathologists who are medical doctors, which is why they will use someone like me, because they know when it comes down to the skeleton, we probably know a little bit more. I would say I am a forensic anthropologist and don't have any other specialties.
And can you give us a brief description, if you haven't already, what forensic anthropology is?
Well, it's chiefly the study of the human body, mostly the skeleton, to help out in a court of law. So we do exams initially to help the pathologist understand as much as he or she can about the decedent. Most of the cases I work on are not homicides. They're not homicides, and they're not going to go to court. The cases I work on that are homicides, then that other level kicks in. If we write a report and then a suspect is found and a trial is arranged, then I feel my role, and I think my colleagues agree, that our role as a forensic anthropologist is help you understand what the issues related to forensic anthropology are, so then that kind of helps everybody in the courtroom be sure that information is portrayed accurately.
And what sort of work have you done in the field of forensic anthropology and physical anthropology before working in Pima County?
Well, I was on the island of Guam for about a year, and I worked on a prehistoric set of skeletal remains of the indigenous people that founded that island back in the 16th century. So I learned a whole lot more about the human skeleton, especially a population of Micronesians, closely related to Polynesians, the people in Hawaii and Tahiti, which is always good for a physical anthropologist and a forensic anthropologist, because the training I received in Arizona was chiefly on American whites, American blacks, American Hispanics, and American Indians. So it's always good for an anthropologist to see what other groups of people look like. After that, for about 5 years, I was hired by the U.S. government to work at the laboratory in Hawaii that was charged, still is, with going overseas and visiting battlefields and airplane crashes, recover the remains of servicemen who were left behind. And whenever remains were recovered, those were brought back to the Hawaii lab. It's called SILHI, then the Central Identification Laboratory, Hawaii, and analyze those remains along with forensic dentists and other experts. I left there in 1996, came to Tucson in 1996, finished my doctoral degree, and then was hired by the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in 2000.
In your capacity as a forensic anthropologist, have you done any work with DMORT? And if you have, can you explain to the jury what DMORT is and what you've done?
I have DMORT, an acronym that stands for the Disaster Mortuary Operation Response Team. I joined them in 1996 and retired from that organization about 5 years ago. And their task is, you might already know, with responding to natural disasters. So I was deployed twice to southern Louisiana in 2005 for hurricanes Katrina and Rita, where my duties were to go out in the field and try to find bodies. It was the first time they were all bodies. I came home for about a month, went back, and by then in southern Louisiana, decomposition being what it is, now we had decomposed bodies and bones of people who died in the hurricane. And then those remains were brought to a portable lab, portable morgue, and I did the same kind of analysis on those bodies and bones that I do in my daily job in Tucson. I guess in 2010 was the Haitian earthquake in Haiti. So I was deployed to Haiti for about 3 weeks. Did the same kind of thing, helping remove bodies from the rubble. And when those bodies were taken back to the portable morgue, do a forensic anthropology analysis on them.
And In your capacity as a forensic anthropologist, have you conducted trainings for law enforcement and other entities?
I have. Dating back to graduate school in the mid-'80s, a man who trained me, the late Dr. Walter Berkby, he was one of the first anthropologists in the country that would assist local law enforcement, state law enforcement, the FBI, whenever they had a training exercise where they wanted to train new officers, and they wanted to know how to recover a body, a clandestine grave from a shallow grave somewhere in the woods or the desert, or how to search for bones on the surface. And then, as importantly, if not more importantly, what a forensic anthropologist could bring to the table. So I've been doing that since 1986. I think I did my most recent one before the pandemic. I'll probably do more this year and next year.
And do any of those trainings include a training for the police department of the Tohono O'odham Indian Nation?
They do. The TOPD, the Tohono O'odham Police Department, are valued partners of ours, chiefly because of all the foreign nationals, presumed migrants out of Mexico and Central America that crossed into southern Arizona, die in the Sonoran Desert. At least half of the 3,000 people, 3,000 of these people have died in the last 20 years. At least half of them have died on the reservation. So we partner with the TOPD. They want to know what we can help their officers with. We want to know what their officers are doing as far as recovering remains. So we have a great partnership with them.
And have you done trainings for the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Multiple times. There's a standard FBI workshop that I participated in. And then about a decade ago, I was made aware that there's a task force within the FBI called CART. I think that's Child Abduction Response Team. So that training, all these FBI agents that wanted to do CART training, they of course wanted to know, in the case of a child who was abducted and then murdered and then perhaps buried in a shallow grave somewhere or thrown out in the woods, they wanted to know the best way to search for those kinds of features.
And have you done a training for the Arizona Homicide Investigators Association? Can you
Dating
explain
back to 1986, they even made me an honorary member of the Arizona Homicide Investigators. And as a son of a policeman, I very much enjoyed having that. And my late father also thought that was one of the more important things I could do in my career, become an honorary Arizona Homicide Investigator.
And in your capacity as a forensic anthropologist, have you published articles, chapters, and books in that field as well? Could you recite a few of those?
Yeah, yes, all of those. Scientific journals, a couple popular journals, several book chapters. I've never counted them, but it must be close to 50 publications, I would say, related to forensic anthropology.
And as a forensic anthropologist, can you recite some of the law enforcement organizations that you have consulted with or worked with throughout the country and the nation?
Well, certainly Tucson Police Department, Pima County Sheriff's Office. All these sheriff's offices from every county in Arizona except Maricopa, where Phoenix is. They have their own anthropologists. But all the other 14 counties, all their sheriff's offices, FBI. Marion, Indiana Police Department. The prosecutor's office in Boise, Idaho, most recently. FBI in Phoenix, the Navajo Police Department. I'm sure there's more, but it seems like everybody but Maricopa County. I'll leave it at that.
It's safe to say you've consulted with and worked with a lot of law enforcement organizations.
Yeah, in homicides, in homicides where the pathologist wants a second examination from me, it's going to be working with, eventually it's going to be working with law enforcement. And if a suspect, as I mentioned, is found and a trial is arranged, then that's going to be ratcheted up to the county prosecutor's office or the FBI, the Attorney General. Is that right? The FBI uses So who's the FBI use?
You'd have to ask some previous witnesses who've been through here previously, Doctor. Let me ask you another question. You mentioned that you're a member of the ABFA. Can you give us an idea of what that is and what membership and certification from the ABFA means?
Yeah, it's the only accrediting board we have for our profession. It stands for the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. There's about 150 of us. We have to practice our craft for 3 years before we can even apply, take the exam. We apply to the exam with some credentials and some examples of report writing and a fee. And then the governing board decides whether or not we're worthy to sit for this 8-hour-long exam. And if you are deemed worthy and you do sit for the exam and you do pass the exam, you're then called a diplomat in the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. Like I said, there's about 140 or 150 of us nationally.
And each one of those diplomats is given a number when they get in, right? What's your number?
Mine's 76.
And I believe you also mentioned a few moments ago the scientific working group on anthropology.
Yeah, that's as important as ABFA accreditation, because about 10, 12 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences came down hard on forensic scientists for not having their act together as far as the various disciplines: anthropology, pathology, DNA, biology, fingerprints, engineering, not having standards. So every discipline within the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, there's about 12 of those, anthropology included, put together these groups called working groups, and ours was the SWIGAN, Scientific Working Group in Anthropology. And as I think I mentioned earlier, we were first tasked to come up with what are the minimum requirements to call yourself a forensic anthropologist and to practice forensic anthropology. 3 or 4 years into that, we then moved to best practices. Okay, now that you meet the minimum qualifications, what should and shouldn't you be doing?
And have you been qualified and testified as an expert in the field of anthropology?
I have.
And how many times roughly do you think you've testified as an expert witness qualified in forensic anthropology?
Between 12 and 15.
And where's that testimony taken place?
Mostly Pima County, Arizona, Navajo County, Arizona, the county that Boise, Idaho is in, and here.
And those times you've been called to testify as an expert in forensic anthropology, in court, who called you as a witness? Was it the prosecution or defense?
Prosecution.
Your Honor, at this time I would move to qualify Dr. Bruce Anderson as an expert in the field of forensic anthropology.
Good morning, Doctor. Your Honor, the people have no objection.
Okay, he'll be qualified as an expert in forensic anthropology.
And you talked, I'm sorry. And you talked about this a little bit, but I'd like you to explain to the jury a little bit more about the kind of examinations you do for the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. Explain the process that gets you into looking at remains and analyzing them and what you do, please.
Well, it's varied. The most typical is a skeletonized set of remains, usually partial, because the person died outside. An animal got to the body before the authorities did. So partial skeletal remains, of which the forensic pathologist, the medical doctor says, it's human, I think, but we need more information. All the way through decomposed bodies, mummified bodies, burnt bodies, fresh bodies, bodies of children who were alive 2 days earlier and now they're dead, and the police suspect child abuse. And while the forensic pathologist may be able to come up with the cause and manner of death right there at autopsy or shortly afterwards, there may be some questionable findings, some X-ray studies that show little bumps or little holes in the child's bones. And many times the pathologist will ask the forensic anthropologist to take a closer look at these little anomalies on the bones to see if, in fact, they are healed trauma, and of course that's a very important finding if you have a dead child suspected of being killed by the people who are supposed to protect that child.
It sounds like, and can you explain to the jury if you have training and experience in recognizing and identifying injuries to bones?
I do. Some 30, closing in on 40 years of what righteous injuries look like versus pathognomical changes that happen to a body after they're dead that can be produced by animal activity and other agents like that have nothing to do with the death, but can produce marks on bones, break bones, that do it in a way that's different than when the person was alive or right at the time of their death.
And it sounds like you also have training and experience in being able to recognize evidence of animal scavenging, post-mortem animal scavenging. Is that correct?
I do. Of these 3,000 presumed migrants that have been found in southern Arizona over the last 20 years, I've probably looked at 2,000 of them. And vast majority were partial remains, missing at least a hand or a finger or a foot or most of the body. And when a person dies in a remote area like the Sonoran Desert, the assumption is it's going to be coyotes and vultures. If a person dies close to a residential area, then it's very likely going to be dogs. And it's not unusual for a dog to bring a human bone back into the yard, and then the homeowners call the police and we find out that's human, and then we look around the yard to see if we can find the rest of the person.
And you mentioned a phrase I'm going to ask you to define for the jury, and that's taphonomy or taphonomic. Can you explain what that is, just to orient the jury?
Taphonomy is a study of all these things that can happen to a body after death. So whether it's a mastodon, a lizard, or a human being. Once that person's dead, what can happen to the body, especially for forensic anthropology, what can happen that mimics or can confuse or maybe obscure righteous trauma that happened during that person's life and at the moment of their death.
And you're using a term righteous trauma. Unpack that for us, please.
Oh, you may hear the terms antemortem trauma. That's trauma that happens in life, right? We cut ourselves, we survive, we get a scab, we bleed, it heals, we get a scab pulls up, we might get a scar, we might not get a scar, boom, it's gone, that's antemortem trauma. You've ever gotten up at night and bumped your shin into the coffee table, like I have a few times, and it hurts really bad, doesn't bleed, but you get a little bump over your shin? That's going to produce a little knob of bone on your shin. And you live, that heals up, doesn't hurt anymore. That's antemortem trauma. Perimortem trauma is trauma that's literally antemortem, but it's trauma that causes or contributes to the person's death. So peri just means at or mortem means death, right? So antemortem is before death, perimortem is at or around the time of death. So those are the two important types of trauma for forensic pathologists and anthropologists to discern from the decedent. You may also hear the term postmortem trauma. We don't use that. In fact, one of the items we addressed in the SWIGAP meeting 10 years ago was let's not call something that clearly happened after the person's death trauma. We call it alteration. We call it breakage. In my reports, if I have, say, a spiral fracture that I think was caused when the person fell off a cliff, and that probably contributed to his or her death, then the body's not found for a week or two, and coyotes got to the body, and they make some other fractures or breaks. I will call that postmortem breakage, not to put it in the same category as true trauma, antemortem and perimortem trauma.
So if I understand you correctly, damage done to bones after the person's dead, you categorize it as postmortem
breakage, alteration. Yeah. And the SWIGAP, some of the findings, some of the recommendations from SWIGAP was to use that terminology and not to use trauma. One of our colleagues said trauma hurts.
And turning your attention to this case, did you have the opportunity to look at the remains of Dylan Redwine, the skeletal remains?
I looked at 5 or 6 bones.
And did that include looking at the partial cranium as well?
It's a partial cranium, the upper part of the cranium without the face and without the base.
And after looking at, I take it when you're saying 5 or 6 bones, you're referring to post-cranial remains?
Right. There were a few limb bones, some of the thicker, longer bones, the ones that are harder for an average-sized coyote to completely consume. And there's a couple of bones from the shoulder girdle, the clavicle, and the scapula. And then there were highly eroded either finger or toe bones, I couldn't tell because they were eroded, that were labeled being recovered from coyote scat.
And while we're on the topic of those remains, as a forensic anthropologist, what is the significance of finding digits, fingers, toes within coyote scat? What does that mean to you?
Well, we know from our cases, at least we assume in remote areas, that when first fingers and whole hand and toes and whole feet, only a couple bones in the feet that a coyote can't completely munch. All the bones of the hand can be completely munched on by and swallowed by a coyote. So we suspect that's happening in Arizona. So if the coyote or coyotes stick around the area long enough to defecate, you're liable to have some bone fragments in that scat.
Maybe it's belaboring an obvious point. That's obviously evidence of coyote scavenging of remains, correct?
Can't think of another way for human bones to get into a coyote poop than that.
Turning your attention to your examination of the partial cranium in this case, did you see any evidence of animal damage on the cranium?
I did.
And can you describe generally what your observations were of the cranium elements and then where you saw that damage?
Well, all the margins of the upper part of the cranium were broken away. And along those margins were scrapes and scratches, either tooth scratches, maybe from claws. And there was at least one puncture to the bone that we always see in coyote scavenged remains in Arizona on the margins. So the partial bones that we receive, even though the soft ends of the bones are chewed away sensibly by coyotes, they always leave punctures on the other side, because if you have a dog and you watch your dog chomp on a bone in the backyard, you know, they try like heck to get every little piece of bone they can out there and they're off of that bone, and they're not only removing part of the bone, but they're leaving that signature of gnawing and puncturing as part of that signature on the thicker part of the bone that we recovered. And the cranium of this young man had at least one of those.
Permission to approach and present the witness with an exhibit that's already, and it's up here. I'm going to present you with what's been previously admitted and marked as prosecution 521. We were talking about animal scavenging along, I think it was the edges of the upper cranium. I'd ask you at this time to demonstrate to the jury on this model what you're talking about as far as the animal damage to the head of the elephant.
This is a plastic cranium, not real. The bones present for examination were the frontal, both parietal, most of the occipital, the right temporal, and I think a little bit of the right sphenoid. Everything else is gone. So the face is gone. This big hole in the bottom called the foramen magnum, that's one of the areas, as is the face, where animals gnawing on human remains can actually break that away and open up, in this case of a child, open up the brain case to ostensibly feed on the brain. But through the orbits, if you watch my finger, down this way, put in the right mastoid process. This is a temporal mastoid process. It had some bone removed. And then down this way, coming to the other side, the whole left parietal was missing back to the left orbit. That's all missing. So can't evaluate that. Don't know what happened to that. But along those margins of the bones that remain, that were recovered, there are scratches and punctures and what I would call the signature of canid, coyote or dog depredation, and that's feeding the remains of a dead person.
Permission to publish what's already been admitted as defense 1721, please.
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what we're looking at here and where you see evidence of animal damage?
We're looking at the top of the cranium, the superior part. So following my finger here on this suture, and then this suture here, that T intersection is what we call bregma, a Latin name for a landmark, bregma. And on the left parietal, there are multiple, I can't hardly see them on this slide, but there are multiple, there you go, scratches, gouges that are quite consistent with either, I think they're tooth marks. It could be claw marks, but I think they're tooth marks because if you can imagine using your fingernails to try to pick up a cue ball, try to pull cue ball, is that going to work? It's going to keep slipping off, right? So whereas a coyote, as I mentioned to earlier, or a dog or another canid, can grab some of these parts of the cranium and break them off, they can't with their teeth. The animal isn't large enough. A larger animal could, but a coyote-sized canid can't do that. So I think it's related to this action of the mouth trying to pick up the cranium or trying to maybe break off, like this right mastoid process of the temporal, as I mentioned earlier, was broken away. So that kind of action to break away the bottom part, the basic cranium, with the lower jaw, the upper teeth then would have to contact the upper part of the cranium. So those marks are quite consistent with an animal trying to either grab the cranium and take it away, to try to break off other portions.
Show you another picture here. What's been previously admitted as 1725. I have an ongoing order to publish.
You do have that order, but I need you talking next to the microphone. Yes, I should also.
Publishing 1725. Can you explain to the jury what we're looking at here and what evidence you see of animal damage to the cranium?
We're looking at this view here. Those squiggly lines to the left, the suture, that's the coronal suture. The squiggly lines to the right, the rhamnoidal suture. Those are the anterior and posterior limitations of the parietal bone, which is right here. All of the, so this is kind of the orientation of what you're looking at with all of the temporal bone, this bone here, and the zygomatic bone missing. And
do you see, or where do you see, if any, evidence of animal damage? Is it along that edge, or?
Those two V-shaped, those two, the little curvilinear defect to your left, lower left, that's natural. That's what we call the squamosal suture for the parietal bone and the temporal bone articulate. The other two, more stair-step, kind of angulated, that's a break, that's a fracture. It's either happened really close to the child's death, or could have happened months after. There's some characteristics of those breaks that suggest there was some drying out of the bone before those breaks were produced.
And there is a pointer right in front of you to the left of the extent, to the left of the model skull.
Oh.
As we go forward.
Oh, not a laser pointer, it's literally a pointer, okay? Wow. Trying to turn this on and...
Seeking to publish what's been previously admitted as defense 1722-1723. Walk us through what we're seeing as far as what bones on the left and then what bones on the right, and then your analysis as a forensic anthropologist of these pictures as a suite.
Photograph on the left is showing the frontal bone and both parietal. The face is missing. You can see to the lower left of that left-hand photo the curved margin of the right orbit. That's the right eye orbit. Then above the left eye orbit, which is missing, there's somewhat of a curvilinear fracture, a break.
Can you use the pointer to I'm going to make you use the analog pointer.
You're going to make me stand up?
I'm going to make you stand up, Doctor.
You also need to talk into the microphone. You can pull it out if you want to. The microphone right there.
So frontal bone, right parietal, left parietal is the right orbital margin, the right eye orbit. The left eye orbit is missing, both away from the perimortem type fracture. And I'm going to use the word perimortem type fracture because that fracture was produced when the bone was still wet or moist. It still retains what we call elastic properties. The bone is comprised mostly of calcium, salts, other minerals, and collagen. The protein that's strand-like.
And if I can interrupt, Doctor, I am going to ask you to hold that microphone right up close to when you're talking.
Okay, is this better?
That is, actually. Thank you.
So as far as this curvilinear perimortem type fracture, I say perimortem type because it's fractured the way you'd expect a fracture to occur in somebody who is alive or who just was killed from that insult that caused that kind of fracture. But because bone dries out slowly and the collagen persists for certainly days, maybe even weeks, maybe longer in certain moist conditions, the bone will break 2 or 3 weeks after death, the same way it would break while the person was alive. So that's a perimortem type fracture, but it's quite consistent with post-mortem animal depredation. So there's no reason to think that fracture has to be related to what caused this young man's death. Could be. We don't have the rest of the face to evaluate. It could be. But it could also be, and it's something we see on a regular basis in Arizona. When coyotes break open bones and they twist on bones, they produce these types of fractures. And these are bodies that we know the person was dead 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 weeks. There's still a lot of flesh on the bodies when they're found. They've been fed up by coyotes and we see these types of fractures. And if there's no other reason in the remote desert that's flat, nothing to fall off of, if there's no other reason to suspect that was truly contributory to the person's death, then we attribute that to perimortem type fracture, post-mortem animal death.
Can we see the same fracture from a different angle in the photo on the right?
This is an ectocranial outside view. Looking at this surface, looking at the endocranial or visceral surface, the surface that the brain touches, we see the same kind of fracture. We see the same fracture. So it went all the way through what we call the outer table of the bone. Bone is somewhat like cardboard. This bone in this area is somewhat like cardboard. There's a thick cortical sheet, a kind of a wavy middle, and then there's another thick cortical sheet. So it went through the ectocranial endocranial.
Can you explain what, on the second photo, what I'm just going to call that dot up there in the upper, right in there? Yes, sir.
This dot is a puncture. It has to be a tooth puncture. I guess other things could cause it.
And I'm going to ask you to hold that up
But
close.
it's quite consistent with a tooth puncture, probably a canine. And it's directly opposite all of these scratches up here. So I think, and some other scratches on the front of it. Let me correct myself. Not opposite these scratches. There are some other scratches here above the right eye that I think indicates that an animal that canid had that cranium, that partial cranium in its jaws. Probably the lower canine punctured the inner cable, and then the upper canine and inside was ripping that bone. So I think there's pretty good evidence that this bone shows that it was in the mouth of the canid.
Magnifying 1722, the photo on the viewer's left, does that make it easier to see what you've identified as animal damage to that portion of the cranium?
And that's, if I may, that's not unusual. We know that coyotes in Arizona, they range maybe 50 square miles. We've seen coyotes run away from helicopters. We're in helicopters, they're not. We've seen coyotes run away from the side of a body, skeletonized body. We found remains of the same person 1 mile away, 5 miles away, 20 miles away. And both the remains at the place we think was where the person died, where the body was deposited, and then the place a mile or 2 or 20 away, the skeletal elements have signatures of coyote or canid feeding on it. How do we know it's the same person? For DNA studies. We have spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to identify 3,000 migrants, presumed migrants, who died in southern Arizona. That we have had DNA labs tell us that the bone found 3 years later, 15 miles away, is the same person who was missing that bone. That person that was found maybe more intact, had flesh on the person. And now 3 years later, sun-bleached bone is found, and it's the same DNA, so it's the same person. You could postulate that people moved it. If it's on a hill and it's only a few hundred yards, gravity could have moved those bones. If you die in a wash, a dry wash, and then the rains come, water action can move those bones. But that can't happen on flat ground on a desert floor for 15 miles, 10 miles, unless somebody picks it up and takes it. Could be a person. That's happened before. People pick up bones sometimes. But it also could be a coyote. And since we know they range 50 square miles, and we know parents take bones back to the den, it just makes sense.
Seek to publish already admitted defense 1728. Again, if you can explain what part of the cranium we're looking at here, and if you need me to zoom to demonstrate where you see evidence of animal damage, just let me know, Doctor.
The right side of the cranium. Excuse me. The right side of a cranium. It shows the parietal bone, a little bit of sphenoid, the temporal bone, and the occipital bone. The right mastoid is fractured away, broken away. Most of the sphenoid is missing, and then this hole here is what we call the external auditory meatus. It's for your ear. This is your ear canal, the bone here. Just anterior, just forward about an inch, and feel it on your face. It's an arch of bone called the zygomatic arch, and it's broken away. So the root of the
in on the zygomatic arch on this exhibit. What do you attribute the breaking of the zygomatic root to, in your expert opinion?
Well, it's quite consistent, given that every other part of the cranium is missing and broken away. It's quite consistent that this is the animal activity. The animal either picked up the cranium and the zygomatic arch is still attached, broken, or it's gnawing away at the margin of its cranium. It broke the arch at that point.
And what evidence do you see once we zoom in of animals gnawing on this portion of the element?
A little defect right here, a little gouge. To my eye, it looks like a tooth mark.
And how about to the left of the meatus?
Can you appreciate the broken appearance here and the somewhat vacuous-looking area? Your mastoid processes are hollow, full of dozens of hundreds of hair cells. It's normal anatomy. So the bone covering is doing exactly that, and it takes a little bit of effort to break that away. But a coyote or another animal chewing, and it's enough. Right? It's one of these parts of the body that an animal like a coyote gets their mouth on. Like top of the ball,
How would a coyote get their mouth on that part of the cranium, and could you demonstrate that on the model?
In an adult, certainly me, most of you, this is basically one bone all fused together. It comes from 26 separate name bones. By the time you get to your third decade of life, it's pretty much all knitted together. All these pieces are all knitted together in one bone. Very hard for coyotes to break open the cranial wall, the base of the cranium. They can chew the face off, and frequently we do. We do get faceless crania that have been laying out the desert for months and years. But in an adult, they're not strong enough to break open each of the brain pieces. In a child, though, 12, 13-year-old child, these bones are not knitted together. They're separate. So if a coyote can get any kind of a leverage, it can pop off one of the bones. And then once you get an area larger than the foramen magnum, then they are strong enough to keep breaking the margins, breaking the faces. And while they're doing that, you can imagine, as I mentioned earlier, parts that are missing we assume were consumed or taken away by the animal. The parts that are recovered, the margins always have some signature of cavity. And that's what I think the broken mastoid is.
And I'm going to approach with one more exhibit here.
All right.
You can have a seat, Doctor.
Thank you.
And the kind of injuries you've just described to the cranium and how a coyote or a canid can do that, are those injuries you've seen in your practice as a forensic anthropologist in Arizona over the thousands of remains that you've studied? Is that...
They're not injuries. They're definitely not injuries. They're pathognomic alterations. They're things that happen after the person was deceased.
And I'm going to ask to publish what's been previously admitted as defendants 1798. And when that comes up, which it has, Doctor, I'm going to ask you to use the microphone and the pointer and explain to the jury what kind of damage you see to this element.
Let's see if I can do it from here with my finger. So we're looking, that hole to the left is the right external auditory meatus, the ear canal, the bony ear canal. And just to the right is about a half an inch of zygomatic root. I'm holding the cranium by the zygomatic arch here. So the root of the zygomatic arch is on the temporal bone, and we call it the root. And that's broken off probably about where my fingernail is.
And above where the break is, do you see any marks, and what is your expert opinion of the cause of those marks?
This is breakage. This is quite consistent with post-mortem breakage from animal scavenging. And right about here, there's a little gouge that I think is caused by a tooth. And I think it's caused by a tooth because it looks more like a tooth gouge to me. And it's right next to a part of the cranium here, and as we saw earlier with the broken part. We know some animal is feeding on that part of the cranium. So it just makes sense to me that the animal's mouth, it would be an incisor tooth, unlike the puncture that I think is a canine tooth, the longer, funnier, more conical shaped tooth. Incisor in a coyote, it sits on the bottom and four on top. They're quite small and quite sharp.
And I just zoomed in on the exhibit. If I understand correctly, go ahead.
So if you see the shadow here, jurors, if you see the shadow, this is, I think, the area that the defense counsel is referring to. And again, it would be, if you're talking about an animal breaking away zygomatic arch, it makes sense that the mouth, some of the mouth has to go upwards to be posterior and anatomical. But some of the mouth, some of the teeth of the mouth have to gain purchase on the bone with the higher end. So to me, it's quite consistent with animal deprivation.
And when you looked at this portion of the cranium in person, not on a photo, did you notice anything stuck in that mark? And can you describe what that was?
There's a little globule of white residue, and knowing a little bit about what other anthropologists did with these remains, I assumed it was due to trying to make a latex mold from that area, from which then you could pour plaster of Paris in to produce a cast of what that defect looks like.
And you can have a seat, Doctor. In your experience as a forensic anthropologist, have you heard it posited or even taught that animal scavenging marks will be shaped like a U and man-made tool marks will be shaped like a V?
That's a textbook description of one of the ways we're supposed to differentiate knife or sharp force injuries from tooth alterations.
And what do you think about that postulation? Is that always true?
No, it's not always true. And like most things in life, that can be a U or be a V. There's going to be some gray area in between. For instance, a dull knife can penetrate skin and still scratch bone. That's not going to be a true V. It's going to be somewhat modified. And incisors, small anterior teeth in a dog or coyote, can be sharper than a dull knife. Therefore, that would be also some kind of a modified U. A canine tooth is going to give a U-shaped gouge. A molar is going to give a U-shaped gouge. But the spatulate-shaped teeth of the front of the mouth, and us too, but in coyotes especially because they're smaller, more narrow teeth, the incisal edge can be very sharp.
And you've talked a little bit about the difference between a juvenile cranium and an adult cranium. Can you explain to the court what vascularization and the formation of sulci is?
The face of a child this age, 12, 13, is probably the most rapidly growing part of the body. And certainly the bony part is. bone can grow faster and does grow faster throughout the body, but especially on the cranium and the head. It can grow faster than veins, arteries, and nerves can stretch. It can grow and stretch. And as the bone grows, it starts to embed what we call neurovascular bundles. And these are just veins, arteries, and nerves all running together. So it's the way we're made to the various parts of the body. And if the bone grows faster than the neurovascular bundles can stretch, they start to embed, and then you get a naturally caused groove. The Latin word for groove is sulcus. So we call this a sulcus. If we have more than one, we call it sulci, S-U-L-C-I. So these are naturally formed. We understand the etiology. It's bone growing faster than a neurovascular bundle can stretch. Sometimes the neurovascular bundles catch up in life. If you live long enough, the bone remodels and you don't have any evidence of that. Sometimes they persist. Sometimes the bone grows so fast it actually covers over the neurovascular bundle, and now the neurovascular bundle goes through a tunnel. So we have this great gradation and pretty good understanding of how these sulci are formed.
And if I understand you correctly, and please tell me if I'm getting this wrong, the formation of these bundles can actually produce grooves in bone, and those grooves are called sulcus or sulci if there's more than one.
That's correct.
You testified a little bit about coyote scavenging and coyotes' ability to carry remains. What is your basis in knowledge for knowing how far a coyote can carry skeletized or unskeletized human remains?
Well, some of it's ancillary. Like I said, people in helicopters looking at search scenes where you know there's skeletal, there's bones, there's skeletonized bones, and coyotes leaving the area. It's not infrequent to find either bird or coyote scat at recovery sites, so we know that the animal was staying there long enough to defecate. But I think the most convincing and the most scientific is what I mentioned earlier. We have over 50 examples, many of which are miles apart and years apart, where a human being who died at that location and is missing part, when found, is missing part of their skeleton. Some of those parts are found miles and years away, and we know through DNA analysis it's the same person. So, as I hope I made it clear a little earlier, there's really only two ways for that to happen. A person picks up the bones and takes it, or a canid picks up the bones and takes it. And I think it's probably more likely it's the animal and not the person.
In your expert opinion, is it possible for a coyote or presumably other canid to carry remains from one site 1.5 miles to their den or to another site?
Yeah, we've demonstrated over 50 times that's happened in the Sonoran Desert.
And what if that 1.5 miles meant the canid had to go up a steep hill, 1,500 feet, and then down another 900 feet on the other side?
I think they could probably do it.
Why do you think you'd do that?
I've got a dog. My dog can outrun me in the hills, so I imagine a coyote can too.
And Doctor, your experience with coyotes and scavenging and even a lot of forensic anthropology, it stems from your experience in the Sonoran Desert, right?
Correct.
And give us a brief description of what the Sonoran Desert looks like in case someone don't know.
Doesn't look like this. We have mountains. We have beautiful greenery in the wintertime. Most of the vegetation is scrub, a lot of mesquite, palo verde, a lot of plants with stickers on them. A lot of cactus, of course, saguaro cactus. The Sonoran Desert is known for this saguaro cactus. Little shade, and the little shade there is, you have to get on your belly and crawl under a small scrub tree to gain that shade. It's not the Sahara Desert. It's not devoid of vegetation. It's not all sand. It is sandy. But because Mexico is a higher elevation than Arizona, water runs from the south to the north. It dumps eventually in the Gila River, which then eventually dumps into the Colorado River. So there are a multitude of washes, dry usually, running from Mexico towards Phoenix, water runs predictably once or twice or 10 times a year. So the plants are higher and taller and more lush in these areas, and those tend to be the areas where migrants cross. So we do have some shade, but we have extremely high temperatures from about May to September. It's deadly year-round, but it's deadlier from May to September. We don't get too much cool. We get a summer monsoonal rain, but it's sporadic. It never rains in a large area at the same time. If you know about monsoons in Southeast Asia, they're huge events. The Arizona monsoons are just little downpours. In the city, it could be raining on your block and not the block over. So we get a little bit of water, more water in the winter than the summer, but it's very hot and inhospitable.
And Doctor, obviously you know that Dylan Redwine's remains were not found in the Sonoran Desert. They're found in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, right?
That's correct.
And understanding that geography in the San Juan Mountains is very different than the geography of the Sonoran Desert, does that degrade or change your analysis that this scavenging and carrying of remains could have been done by coyotes?
No.
Why not?
Well, I'm not a coyote expert. Our coyote in Arizona is latrans, Canis latrans. I don't know what yours is, but I bet it's a very close relative of Canis latrans. They seem to be about the same size. A little bit of research I did 2 years ago when I was.
Your Honor, sorry. Objection. I don't believe the witness is qualified as a coyote expert. I think he just said that himself. I would ask him not go any further with this answer.
He's not qualified as a biologist or vertebrate biologist, but he has talked extensively about his experience with observing coyote scavenging in first person and in labs. And I think he's further educating the jury about the scavenging behavior of coyotes.
Well, he can educate about the scavenging behavior of coyotes that he's aware of. These may be exactly the same, they may be close, but he really can't testify to that as an expert, so I'm not going to let him do it.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Would the terrain you know of in Colorado be prohibitive for a coyote to carry remains that distance?
I wouldn't think so.
Nothing further at this time.
Cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you today? You're currently with the Pima County of the Office of the Medical Examiner, is that right?
Yes.
And your role there, as you shared on direct, is as a forensic anthropologist,
Correct.
not a pathologist.
Correct.
So your specific job doesn't involve determining the cause and manner of death.
That's right.
And in this case, you've been retained by and you're being paid by the defendant.
I'm sorry?
You've been retained by and you're being paid by the defendant.
Correct.
You've worked throughout your long career, primarily in Pima County, Arizona.
That's right.
And just to get the timeline straight in terms of this case, you spoke with the defendant's attorney in June of 2019, all right?
That's right.
And then you examined the skeletal remains of Dylan Redwine in June of 2019.
That's right.
And following that conversation with the defendant's attorney and your examination of Dylan Redwine's skeletal remains, you produced a one-page report in July of 2019.
I believe it's 2 pages, or at least a page and a paragraph.
So perhaps the page and a signature line on the next page.
I don't believe I signed it. Yeah, it's a page and a paragraph, and I think I just initialed it.
And you've talked a lot about scavenging here, Doctor, and you've certainly done a lot with that in your career, right?
I've been trying to interpret scavenging versus righteous trauma, yes.
And you're aware that all the experts in this case agree that Dylan's body was fed on by scavengers after he was dead, right?
I'm not aware of that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, you've read Dr. Francis' report, right?
I don't know if I did read her report. I didn't read her. I examined these remains before I asked the defense attorney to tell me what the other anthropologist said. So if I did read it, it was 2 years ago.
So my question is, so you've had an opportunity to review Dr. Francis' report, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've had an opportunity to review Dr. Mulhern's report, is that correct?
Is he or she the pathologist?
She was a local anthropologist, sir.
Yeah. If defense attorney made those available to me, and this was on a, I believe, a Dropbox situation, then yeah, I had that opportunity.
And you mentioned the forensic pathologist. You had an opportunity to review Dr. Kurtzman's report. Is that true, Doctor?
That's true.
So it's fair to say that all the experts in this case agree that Dylan's body was fed on by scavengers after he was dead.
Of those people you mentioned, yes.
And you agree with that?
Yeah, I most certainly agree with that.
And you agree that there's a question of how Dylan was killed and ended up there?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
You would agree that there's a question as to how Dylan Redwine was actually killed and ended up where he did?
I certainly can't bring anything to bear on that.
So in this case, you examined the remains in June of 2019, and that includes the cranium and the postcranial remains?
Yes.
And by postcranial remains, just so I'm clear, I'm referring to the tibia, the femur, and the toes from the left and right feet.
It's everything below the head.
Did not use a microscope when you did your examination, am I right?
I used a 10-power loop. I brought a light source and a 10-power loop.
10 power or 8 power? Sorry.
I believe it was 10.
One moment. Do you recall speaking about this case previously?
I'm sorry, I'm
Sorry. Do you recall speaking about this case previously?
previous to what?
Today.
Today?
Previous to today, have you spoken about this case with anyone?
Only defense counsel and you a month ago.
Correct. And you also spoke with the prosecution team in 2020 as well, am I right?
Is that your predecessor?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
And do you recall saying that you used an 8-power magnifying glass?
If I said it was an 8, it's an 8. I'm going from memory here, and if I said it was an 8, then it was an 8, and it's not a 10.
But either way, the point is using a magnifying glass, either 8-power or 10-power.
Yeah, and if I may, my laboratory has 40 times power, which is what I would have used in Tucson, but that was not possible. So I would have preferred to have more magnification.
Of course, because it would have allowed you to see these things better
Yes.
and more close up.
The parts that I could see, yes.
And just to put it in layperson terms, 8-power means it's 8 times the magnification, right?
To my understanding, that's what it means.
40-power being 40 times the magnification.
Right.
And if you use the dissection microscope, which you did not use in this case, it would be 100 times magnification, all right?
I could. Our dissection microscope goes that high.
And that's the kind of tools you would normally use in examining bones in the work that you do down in Pima County.
That's right.
And that's not what you did in this case, all right?
That's correct.
You talked on direct examination about the right zygomatic arch. Do you recall that?
Mentioned it a few times, I believe.
Yes. You said it was consistent with animal activity.
The breakage there at the root of the zygomatic arch, yes.
And you sounded, am I fair to say, certain that it was caused by a tooth?
Oh, the gouge posterior by ½ inch or so to the broken margins of the zygomatic arch, I think is quite consistent with an incisor tooth.
Would you agree with me that it looks suspicious?
Yes, it merited a closer look.
And in fact, you previously have stated that the cut, even under the low magnification that you used in 2019, looked suspicious to you.
I wouldn't call it a cut, but it looks suspicious, yes.
Well, by suspicious, wouldn't that mean a couple things? First, that doesn't belong on someone's body in that location.
No, that's not what I meant by that.
Well, does anyone in this courtroom in your expert opinion, have those marks on their right zygomatic arch right now?
Possibly.
So people walking around with those marks that you've attributed to animals chewing on Dylan Redwine's skull on their body right now?
Can I explain?
Yes, please.
Hopefully none of us have animal gnaw marks on our bones. It was suspicious because that gouge was next to other sulci, these naturally occurring bony depressions. What was suspicious about this one particular one is had a little uplift of bone. So if you recall a half hour ago, I said that these sulci can be shallow, they can be deeper, they can even wrap around and create a tunnel over a neurovascular bundle. Between those two, U-shaped and tunnel is like an inverted omega shape where they can actually bridge over. So they're bridging a little bit. And what was suspicious, what is still suspicious, is something got in what I think is a sulcus. Some agent got in the sulcus and lifted that little roof, mini roof of bone upwards. So I think it's a sulcus, which looks a lot like the other sulci in that same area, but something got in there. I'm postulating it could be a canid incisor.
And your opinion is that the sulcus has an uplifted edge, is that right?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that it appears that some object raked through the sulcus?
I think that's the most likely way for that uplift to occur. I can't think of another way for that little uplifted bony roof to occur.
So you'd agree that some object caused damage to Dylan Redwine's bone at that location?
Yes.
And that damage is not supposed to be there?
That damage is caused by, yes. The short answer is yes. It's not natural, it's not normal.
And it looks suspicious to you?
Because of the uplifted bone.
And it's a perimortem wound, is that right?
Oh, I couldn't say that. That little fracture or break of that bone is so small, I don't know if anybody could say that a perimortem fracture versus a postmortem fracture.
Would you agree with me, though, that a sulcus has rounded edges?
Right. Sulci are grooves, almost always rounded.
Because they're covering one's blood vessels, right?
A blood vessel is imprinting into the growing bone.
And that's why it has a rounded edge, the sulcus.
There's a rounded floor. Yeah.
And under the power of magnification that you used in 2019, you couldn't tell if the sulcus was there, something went into it, or whether a tool caused it. Isn't that true?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Under the power of magnification that you used, you couldn't tell if that's where the sulcus had been, something went into that area, or whether a tool caused it. Isn't that true?
Well, I'm pretty certain it's a sulcus. The question is, what raked through that sulcus to cause a little uplift of bone?
Would you agree with me that you couldn't determine whether a tool had caused it?
Yes, I'll agree to that.
And you've had the opportunity to look over the reports from Dr. Franz, the local anthropologist, the pathologist, as well as the opinions from two doctors of the Arapahoe County Coroner's Office.
I had that opportunity.
I'm going to put 372 on the screen. It's been previously admitted. Yeah. May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Doctor, when you did your examination in 2019, did you look at these photographs?
No.
No?
When I did my examination of the remains, I had not seen that photograph.
Do you see these two marks here?
I see what look like two marks.
But it's your belief that these are tooth marks and not, in fact, cut marks from the tooth.
I believe they're sulci, the naturally occurring depressions from a faster growing bone that a neurovascular bundle can stretch.
But you testified that something raked through the sulci at this location.
The one on the left, I believe, when I examined the bone, here's what I think I know about this photo. It was taken at or near autopsy, years before I examined the bones in the summer of 2019. The bone did not look like that when I examined it. So the lower arrow, the right arrow, I think is pretty clearly a sulcus, it's a rounded bottom. The arrow to the above, to the left, that has a little bit of the uplifting.
So you'd admit that this one has uplifting.
Yeah.
And it's your expert opinion to this jury that this was caused by an animal.
No, the sulcus was caused by normal anatomy. I think they're both sulci, and the upper one is normal anatomy. It's my expert opinion, it's my considered opinion that little uplift of bone relates to something raking through that naturally occurring sulcus.
Something raking through this.
Yes.
So something raked through this.
Yes.
And it's your opinion that this thing was a what?
It's my opinion a tooth is as likely as anything else.
Can you show me, please, the tooth mark on the other side?
Wouldn't need a tooth mark on the other side.
Because the coyote just has teeth along the upper part of its mouth. Wouldn't it have bite marks on the other side if, in fact, it was biting there?
Not a bite mark. Can you imagine taking your teeth, you ever eat ice cream cone with your upper teeth and not have your lower teeth touch it? You just take your upper teeth and you kind of rake through that ice cream on the cone?
So you don't think that's a tooth mark? Is that your testimony?
I think it's a sulcus. And I think something raked through that naturally occurring sulcus. And I don't know what that is, but I'm of the opinion, given all the other damage caused by canid scavenging, that it's as likely a tooth mark, likely a tooth or a claw, I think it went through that sulcus as anything else.
We'll come to claw. But if it's a tooth, you'd agree with me that we'd see parallel bites on the other side of Dylan Redwine's bone. Isn't that true?
I don't think it is. I think an animal can touch a bone that small with one tooth.
Do you think an animal gnawed into the bone hard enough to leave that and not leave any other mark on the other side of the tooth that runs parallel to that one?
Mr. Bogan?
Asked and answered, getting argumentative.
I'll let him answer this question.
I didn't say gnawing. I said a tooth raked through it. Something, a tooth or a claw raked through that sulcus. I never said it clamped down there. I agree with the prosecutor. If it was a clamp down tooth mark, puncture, you might see scratches or punctures on the other side of that zygomatic arch. But I never postulated that.
But we agree that if it was a tooth mark and the animal was clamping down on it, you would see a tooth mark or something on the other side just because of the natural formation of the animal's mouth. Is that what you just said?
That's a hypothetical. I'm not saying it's a tooth mark. I'm saying a tooth, incisor tooth, or a claw raked through a naturally occurring sulcus. So the only mark would be, that's not even a mark. It's something raking through that sulcus that caused a little bit of uplift. So the only mark is that uplifted piece of bone. There's not a scratch, there's not a puncture, but something went through that, in my mind, something went through that sulcus, something very small.
You mentioned claws as a possibility. Claws are made of the same substance as fingernails, am I right?
I believe they're keratin.
And that's the same substance as fingernails, am I right?
I believe so.
Is it your position that one's fingernails can scratch into bone?
I don't know. Never tried that.
In your experience in dealing with bones for 30, almost 40 years, and touching bones, when your fingernails touch bones, do you find yourself leaving marks like that in the work you do?
Well, I don't do that. Two things. I don't do that to bone. And animals have claws, which are, everybody knows, which are not flat, fingernails. They're curved and they're pointy for a reason, and a different reason than we have, fingernails.
Is your testimony that animal claws, which are made of the same substance as fingernails, can scratch into bone?
Let me just say this.
I'm just asking you a question.
I don't know the answer to that, but if I may, a claw could, to my mind, a claw could get in the sulcus and be the uplifting agent to cause that little piece of bone to come up. That's not scratching the bone. It's breaking a piece of bone that's thinner than a sheet of paper, or it's thin as a sheet of paper.
An animal's claw could not cut into bone, am I right?
I don't know that. I'm not an expert in what claws can do.
Spent quite amount of time this morning, Doctor, hearing you talk about claws. So I'm asking you a question. In your expert opinion, could a claw cut into a bone like that?
I don't know, but I'm not postulating that.
I think you did on that, Jeff.
I think so, Your Honor. Thank you. The fracture, you'd agree with me, the skull fracture, that it was perimortem. Am I right?
Perimortem type.
Perimortem type, yeah. And I believe you testified on direct that you would expect that fracture from someone who was alive or possibly killed by that injury, right? That's a possibility.
Perimortem type because bone breaks the same way at death as it does days to weeks later.
Days or weeks later?
I think so. I think there's literature that shows that enough moisture can be retained in bone that it retains its elastic property. Some of the collagen is still active enough to cause the bone to break the same way.
Do you recall when we spoke on June 3rd that you defined perimortem as at the time of death or within hours or days, not weeks or months later?
I didn't say that.
You didn't say that to Investigator Heidel on June 3rd?
That might be what I may have said. That's what a forensic pathologist uses as a perimortem window. Forensic anthropologists most certainly do not say that.
You would agree with me, though, that if the fracture was caused close to the time of death, that would be a significant factor for the jury to consider?
I would think that fracture was caused either at the time of death or, I'm quite sure about this, the bone still retains some elastic property. So days, weeks later, the bone is still moist, and then clearly post-mortem events like coyote scavenging could produce a fracture that looks like that.
You'd agree that the bone was not dried out at the time the fracture occurred?
At that point, that's true. For that fracture, that's true.
And a fair amount of the cranium of Dylan Redwine is missing, is that right?
I think most of it is missing.
And that makes it more difficult to make a determination, is that fair to say?
Well, I could only evaluate what I can see. I'm not quite sure I understand how to answer your question.
When you say you can only evaluate what you can see, did you take photographs of what you saw in June of 2019?
I took some general photographs.
What?
Yeah, general shots. Yes.
Your Honor, the people are not in possession of any photographs that the witness for the defense took. And I would just ask if those have been provided to the prosecution. I do not have them. Permission to approach, Judge.
Yes. Go ahead.
You would agree that taking photographs is important
Absolutely.
and that those should be provided to both sides?
I don't believe I provided them to defense.
So you're with the defense when you examine the cranium, am I right?
I examined the cranium and the 5 or 6 intracranial elements.
And is it your testimony that you took photographs when you were with the defense examining the skeletal remains of Dylan Redwine and never provided the defense with the photographs?
I wasn't asked to provide them.
You provided them with a report, am I right?
I did not provide them with a report. I provided them with a 1-page summary of my findings in bullet statement form.
Sorry, I referred to it as a report, but you're right, it's a 1-page summary. You didn't provide your photographs to the defense?
I wasn't, if I was asked, I don't think I was asked. The defense attorney would have to address that. Might I say, too,
Doctor, I'm going to ask you another question, if I may. You've been doing this a long time, right?
Yes, I have.
And you've done a tremendous amount of work, particularly down with individuals who die near the border, right?
That's true.
And you take photographs as a part of your regular practice.
That's true.
And you've testified as an expert witness before.
I have.
And it's been an honor for you in your career to work with law enforcement and to be part of prosecution of cases. That's what you said.
It's been an honor to work in a courtroom.
Yes. I feel the same way. And whenever you work in a courtroom, you provide the report and the photographs so both sides can look at what you examined when you do the examination. Am I right?
You're partially right. I do that for the remains I examine at work. To bring up the case in Boise, Idaho 2 years ago, I was called by the prosecution to re-examine. I took photographs. I issued the same kind of a bullet statement summary, but I didn't write a report. So to me, my role here, as my role in the Boise, Idaho homicide case, was not as my routine as a forensic anthropologist doing the primary documentation of a case.
I can't speak to Boise, Idaho, but you're aware that in Colorado, the photographs of the expert are turned over to both sides.
Argumentative,
You know what?
irrelevant.
And I don't know why he would know that.
I don't know how I could have been aware of that.
You don't have to answer.
Sorry, Judge.
That's okay.
You agree with me that it'd be helpful for the jury to have seen the photographs you took when you did the examination of the skull in 2019?
No, I don't.
Do you agree with me that the skull that you examined in 2019 looked different in 2019 than the photographs that we had on the screen?
It looked different than, yes, that's true. It was cleaned up and had been altered with some kind of a molding compound.
I'm going to move on.
Can I clarify one thing? These photographs.
Hold on.
Oh.
The whole truth,
You want-
Judge.
If I could just speak for one moment, Your Honor.
I want to hear from you.
If you'd like to complete your answer, you can do so, but then I will likely have a follow-up question if you're not ready to move on from the photographs.
Absolutely. The photos I took were for chain of custody. I took photos of the packaging of the box or boxes, the labels on the box, and then the elements. Because I was limited to my magnification, I could not take a photograph of those scratch marks, of those puncture marks. So it was really for my own chain of custody purposes that I could then say, yeah, these are the bones I looked at. I did take an overall shot of the partial cranium, which of course I then compared to the photographs that the defense had showed me of the partial cranium, and it was the same cranium. So I didn't take them as part of my analysis. I took those photos as part of chain of custody.
Let's switch gears, Doctor. You'd agree with me that if bones are resting on a hillside that they might roll downhill, is that right?
That can happen.
And gravity can affect skeletal remains, is that fair to say?
That would be gravity, I think, pushing the bones downhill.
Gravity, yes. Gravity can affect skeletal remains. So if a person dies on a hillside, the bones can go downhill.
Well, water and wind could also propel bones downhill, but I would imagine gravity is the primary force.
Right. Gravity, water, wind can propel the bones, right?
Sure.
Downhill, right?
Downhill.
Not uphill.
I believe that's correct.
You've seen cases where bodies are dispersed over a wide area and recovered by law enforcement, is that right?
That's correct.
As wide as a football field.
Wider.
And if a bone is missing from a site, say the cranium in this case, It could be a number of things. A coyote consuming it, a coyote bringing it back to its den, or a person moving. Is that fair to say?
Those are some of the agents that can move skeletal remains.
You would agree that birds generally, talking about birds now, do not leave any evidence of scavenging. Is that fair to say?
That's not true at all.
So you would disagree with the expert who says that birds do not leave any evidence of scavenging.
That's patently false.
Do you recall making that statement to Investigator Heidel on January 15th of 2020, that birds do not leave any evidence of scavenging?
I didn't make that statement. Vultures leave a different signature, but very much a signature of scavenging.
How about birds besides vultures, Doctor?
I don't know much about birds besides vultures.
And you understand that we don't have very many vultures here in the great state of Colorado.
Objection. Facts not in evidence. I mean, if he's not an ornithologist, neither is counsel.
Do you have a response or not?
Yes, Your Honor. We've heard a lot about scavenging from the doctor. He's talked about animals in Pima County, Arizona, and the areas he's worked in Arizona. I think it's fair to ask him if he's seen vultures flying here in Colorado.
Well, I don't think so. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Let's talk about the order of scavenging, because there's an order in which the human body is picked apart by scavengers. Is that right?
I don't know that that's true.
Have you read the study by Haglund on the sequence in which the human body is consumed by scavengers?
I have a chapter in that book.
I assume you're familiar with it.
Doesn't mean I agree with every chapter in that book.
Well, in that book, Haglund identifies what's now a very well-known sequence of
Counsel's testifying.
No, he's asking a question. He's familiar with the book. I think it's appropriate. Go ahead.
a very well-known order of scavenging. Do you recall that part of the book, Doctor?
I recall that part of the book as pertains to Seattle, Washington area.
And Haglund, in his study, finds that the head is the absolute last part of the body that is scavenged. Is that true?
According to that study, it's true.
According to Haglund.
According to the study of surface deposited bodies in the Seattle area, that was Dr. Haglund's finding.
Would you agree in your area the head is often located with the decedent's body?
Well, it's also often not located with the decedent's body.
You wouldn't say it's very unusual in your experience for the head to be located near the location where the person died?
It's more likely in disarticulation where the head is removed, both by enzymes in our body, microbes in our body, bugs, flies, and beetles and animal scavenging. It's more likely that the head is taken away from the rest of the body. And we think it's more likely because it's smaller. It can be carried by a coyote in a way that the body can't.
So it's your testimony to the jury that, contrary to what Haglund said, that the head is often taken away from the body.
It doesn't really matter what Dr. Haglund said as far as the Sonoran Desert or this part of Colorado. What we know as forensic anthropologists, and what Dr. Haglund knew, and this is a 25-year-old textbook, is that these kind of taponomical changes are very much related to environment. So what happens in Knoxville, Tennessee, and what happens in San Marcos, Texas, what happens in Grand Junction, Colorado, all three places have body decomposition facilities, is somewhat different. What happens in the Sonoran Desert with little rainfall and intense temperatures, natural mummification, doesn't hold doesn't provide the same evidence, or doesn't go along with the same sequences that these other places have produced. So for me to say, let me just leave it at that. Taponomically speaking, what happens to a body is very much related to the environment it's in, the region of the United States it's in.
So you're saying that given that you're in the Sonoran Desert, the head is often taken from the site where the body is.
I didn't say often. I think your question was, is it unusual? And I said it's unusual. It's as usual for the skull to be missing in a disarticulated body as it is for the head to be intact.
or 50-50?
It happens both ways. And the longer a body lays, if I may, the longer a body lays out in our desert, and I'm sure this holds in any wilderness, and the Sonoran Desert is a wilderness, the more likely critters are going to find the body. And they're going to chew off the fingers, chew off the toes if they can, open the rib cage. The ribs are very soft and easy. Eat all the viscera. Start jerking on the upper limbs and pulling them off because there's no bony attachment between our upper limb and our thorax. So they frequently remove, after they've chewed off the fingers of a hand and maybe the whole hand, they can remove a whole arm. So it's not unusual in our environment for the clavicle, the scapula, the upper arm bone, and the two lower arm bones to be missing on one or both sides from a place where we think we can tell by soil staining where the person decomposed.
So, doctor, in your experience, is the head often located where the person died?
Asked and answered repeatedly.
I'm not sure I have an answer, Your Honor.
I think you have. He said it's, you can't say 50-50, but he says it's pretty common either way. Was that your testimony?
I'm sorry, Judge.
Your testimony was that it's pretty common either way, whether or not the head was located with the rest of the remains or somewhere else.
The longer a body lays out there, the more likely this cranium or skull won't be found with the other remains. But if you go out in a day or a week before the body, all the soft tissue is removed, then it's more likely that the head will be articulated to the spinal column.
Isn't it true that on January 15, 2020, you told investigator Heidel that the head is almost always located with the body?
In fresh bodies,
What if the body's been laying out for a while?
the longer a body
I'll
is,
let him go ahead. Go ahead.
the longer a body lays out in the wilderness, the more likely critters will get to it. And the more likely different bones will be separated from one another.
Are you familiar with the study by Maximilian Cantu?
You have to give me more information. I know the name, you have to give me more information.
Maximilian Cantu worked in your lab, is that right?
He was an intern, I believe.
He cited you in the acknowledgement section for overseeing the report that he did. Do you recall that?
I don't.
Maximilian Cantu did a report over a 4-year period involving the Sonoran Desert and the work at your office, your lab, looking at the recovery of remains for individuals. Do you recall Maximilian Cantu working?
He wrote I believe he wrote a scientific article for the Journal of Forensic Sciences. Am I correct?
Yes. And are you aware that Mr. Cantu's study of your lab found that the human skull, the cranium, is located with the body of the person that died 88% of the time?
Objection, testifying, and Rule 16, Judge.
It's not Rule 16, and I don't think it's testifying. I think it's okay.
Can you give me the year that Mr. Cantu published that?
Sure. It was published in 2014. Mr. Cantu looked at a 4-year period, picked different years that your lab had worked on bodies that have been recovered, including coincidentally 2012. And based on the study of the 4 years, concluded, much like Hagelin, that the cranium is found with the body in 88% of the cases analyzed at your lab.
I'm sure that's accurate. Max was a smart kid in 2010 and 2014, but things have changed. The PMI, the post-mortem interval, and Max would have been looking at border crossers. He would have been looking at surface deposits, people who died in the desert and were recovered sometime afterwards. The post-mortem interval, that's the time between death and the authorities finding and recovering the body. That has increased several fold since 2014. So it was more usual between 2000 and 2014 for bodies, somewhat intact bodies, to be found. Now it's just the opposite. It's more usual since 2014 that we get a bone or two or 5 or 6.
So when Mr. Cantu concludes the skull is often not scavenged at all, as he states on page 42, you're saying that's changed in the last 7 years?
That's exactly what I just tried to tell you.
You visited the scene in this case, Doctor?
I have not.
Do you agree with me that it'd be valuable to visit the scene where the remains are found?
I don't know how that would help me.
Well, you said earlier on direct that the geographical terrain matters a great deal in how body parts are.
That wasn't my charge. The defense asked me to evaluate some defects to bone and whether or not I could opine on what caused those defects.
You didn't view topographical maps of the area where the remains were recovered, did you?
I looked at maps.
Did you review the drone video in this case?
I don't believe so.
Are you particularly familiar with the Vallecito area?
I'm not.
And we live in a mountainous region here as opposed to the Sonora Desert. Is that right?
Having spent some time in Lake City, I kind of understand the terrain down here.
You've examined over 3,000 people who died in the desert over the last 20 years. Is that right?
2,000. 3,000 have died. I've had my hands on about 2,000.
And that's a very different environment than here, right?
Absolutely.
For example, I was struck by, on direct, you said, it's not unusual for dogs to bring human bones into the yard and to their home. Is that right?
That's right.
Would you be surprised to learn it might be unusual in the state of Colorado for dogs to be running up to the back door with human bones in their mouth?
It's likely only unusual because you don't have the number of dead people in the wilderness that's near housing developments as we do in Arizona.
And that's because your job is to try to identify and locate loved ones of individuals who die in what's called undocumented border crossings.
Not because of my job, counselor. It's because of all these dead people in the desert.
What I'm saying is you're doing valuable work trying to identify individuals who died in the desert during what's called an undocumented border crossing.
Thank you. We think the families appreciate our efforts.
That's the work you do.
Most of the work I do.
And in your region, exposure to the sun is the leading cause of death for those who are engaging in what's called an undocumented border crossing. Is that right?
It's not sun, it's heat.
So, for example, in 2006 through 2012, your lab looked at 1,314 cases. The vast majority of those people die of exposure.
Of the presumed migrants, the vast majority, over 50%, we cannot tell how they died because their bodies are decomposed or skeletalized.
Given the geographical terrain of where you're located and the environmental factors, only 4% died of homicide.
That sounds about right. Very fewer homicides.
So 52 of the 1,314 from that 6-year period. Is that right?
I'm guessing you're reading from our annual report, so you've got numbers that I'd have to look up, but that sounds about right.
And in determining whether those 4%, that number, were a homicide, you look at all the surrounding circumstances as well. Am I right?
I don't look at them.
That's the job of the forensic pathologist.
Our medical legal investigators and our forensic pathologists.
And they look at the circumstances under which the person went missing, statements from the family, relationship dynamics, pre-existing health conditions, and so on. Is that right?
Are you talking about border crossers still?
Yes, sir.
The vast majority of the homicides of border crossers is cartel or gang related, and those bodies are found the day the person dies, which means I don't have any role in those. So the pathologist can tell, it's usually gunshot trauma, what the cause of death was. They infer a manner of death because it's going to be very little investigation because it usually happened out in the hinterlands. Because they're foreign national, local law enforcement doesn't use the same resources. But the important point is for those homicides, I almost never have involvement. I can think of one case where a dry skull came in with a bullet hole in it, and we recovered the lead slug from inside the skull. But usually on homicide, I play no role.
And I'll just bring it back to something you talked about on direct, if I may. You talked about person falls off the cliff, they die of perimortem fractures, right?
The fracture, yeah, if it's a skull fracture, then this happens occasionally.
Person falls off a cliff, they die, skull fracture, perimortem.
Right, perimortem trauma, blunt force trauma, the pathologist would probably rule manner of death, accident, cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head.
Accident, the person actually fell off the cliff,
Right.
doctor? As opposed to looking at all the surrounding circumstances to determine whether the person was actually pushed off the cliff.
This is not my role as a forensic anthropologist. Investigators do this.
The fractures the person would suffer if they fell or was pushed off the cliff would be perimortem.
Fracture would be the same. The cause of death would be the same. The manner would be different if the pathologist, if the medical examiner got enough information through law enforcement or investigators that this person was pushed versus fell.
One of the things you look for in your work, because you're trying to locate and identify people who died while trying to cross the border. That's some of what you do, right?
They have crossed the border, then they died in Sonoran Desert in Arizona.
Thank you. So you look for their personal effects as part of that work.
I don't. We have investigators that do that.
And the investigators look for the personal effects because they're trying to identify the individual.
We're trying to
Objection relevance to this whole line, Judge, beyond the scope.
I'm going to sustain it. I mean, it's a little bit outside his expertise. I know he knows about it, but it makes sense. I don't think we need to go there.
What was the last part of what you said, Your Honor? I'm sorry.
You're done with that area.
And we've touched on, but I just want to follow up on the environment and environmental factors in Pima County, the Tucson area, are very different than what we have here in Colorado.
Yes.
Generally no snow, right?
We have mountains that have snow. We have the southernmost ski resort in Flagstaff, Arizona.
In the Sonora Desert, do you usually have snow?
We have mountains in Santa Cruz County that get snow in the wintertime.
Is it fair to say you have high temperatures,
Very high.
intense droughts?
I don't know what the word drought means, but it can go rainless and has, I think, for May and June of this year.
Would you agree with that statement that there's very little moisture in the Sonoran Desert for 11 months out of the year, and as a result of this, the body left in the desert will quickly have moisture removed?
We'll quickly have what?
Moisture removed?
Relevance, Judge.
I think it could be relevant. Go ahead.
I don't know about the 11-month statement, but when it is hot and the desert sands and dirt are hot, and a person dies outside, they will decompose so rapidly within hours. Fingertips, noses, earlobes will turn black. Your skin will turn black within a day. Your bodies will bloat within a day. That bloating will cause tearing of skin, and then that hot desert sand will wick away all the moisture. So then a week later, for instance, there's no moisture left. All the tissues are dry, and there's just a black, greasy spot underneath where the person decomposed.
Much of your work, since the desert, is dealing with coyote scavenging. Is that fair to say?
We think so. Yeah, we think in remote areas it's more likely coyote than dog.
And would you agree that a coyote, when it scavenges a body, it could eat through, for example, a shoe, socks, then eat the individual's toes?
If a person has leather boots on and blue jeans, they're more like, and the rest of the body has been fed on by coyotes, those areas are just as likely not to be attacked. But we have had instances where blue denim jeans are torn, boots are chewed into. So,
and the boots are chewed into, or the sneakers chewed into, because the coyote is going for the meat of the human body.
but I imagine, and not being a coyote, I imagine it's both bone and meat, and it's the odor of the decomposition. Tennis shoes pose no barrier. They're torn away by coyote scavenging, and then the foot is eaten, going to spar up the leg as they can before the bone gets too thick.
And in this case, you're aware, obviously, from what you said earlier, that Dylan Redwine's toes, left and right foot, were eaten and then found in scat.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if they're finger or toe bone, but that vial was labeled recovered from scat.
And you've testified and noted previously that you examined the post-cranial remains, right?
I did. I think there were 5 or 6 limb bones.
I'm going to put 309 on the screen. You mentioned how a tennis shoe could be eaten through by a coyote. Is that something that, in your experience, would be consistent with a coyote scavenging?
You telling me that's Dylan Redwine's shoe?
I believe the evidence would say that it was Dylan Redwine's shoe, yes, sir.
I don't know. What's your question, Counselor?
Just what I asked.
Could you repeat it, please?
It's consistent with what you said, that a coyote scavenged Dylan Redwine's feet.
With the migrants, they frequently, because they're in heat stress, they frequently sit down, take their shoes off, take off everything but their underwear. That is not unusual. So in the coyote scavenging of migrants that have already started to disrobe, we see this all the time.
May I approach, John?
Yes. Need glasses?
Your Honor, I'm a forensic anthropologist. Am I asked to look at clothing?
I don't know. I don't know what the question's going to be. And it's really not your objection. It's defense counsel's objection. So you can ask the question and we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Your Honor. Take a look at Dylan's sock in front of you and tell me what evidence of scavenging you see there.
Objection, Judge. As iterated by the witness, beyond the scope. This has been talked about. He hasn't looked at the sock.
Well, I know he hasn't looked at the sock. Do you have any expertise in terms of what clothing would look like if a person's body had been scavenged? Do you have any experience as part of what you do?
Bodies that are fed on by coyotes, so the shoes are either chewed through or they've been removed. Socks are found. Many times they're tattered. Many times, many times they're tattered.
Okay. So apparently he does have some experience, at least it's part of his job. I'm going to allow him to testify if you have other questions.
Sure. Can you tell the jury about the signs of scavenging you see on that sock, Doctor?
I'm not going to do that, Counselor. I'm not an expert in this. This looks to be a little footy sock. It looks like it's intact. What relevance it has to my testimony, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Okay.
Okay.
Doctor, you testified. I'm sorry.
Let me hear your next question.
Sure. You testified that the shoe of Dylan Redwine is consistent with coyote scavenging. I'm asking you to look at Dylan's
I
sock
didn't say that.
and tell us whether it's consistent with scavenging.
Hold on. One of you can talk at a time.
I'm asking you.
Hold on, and I'm talking now, Mr. Doherty.
Yes, Your Honor.
Maybe I missed it. I don't remember him saying it was consistent with scavenging.
That's because I didn't, Your Honor.
Well, you
Well,
can't talk
I
now
got it.
either. Okay. He said that sometimes, many times, migrants would be taking off their shoes, and so it wouldn't be consistent either way. So I think your question is inappropriate. I think the jury can look at whether or not the sock has been any type of damage to the sock, and I tend to agree that this witness should not be asked about that question.
And Your Honor, just to be clear, the court's ruling is because the witness is not qualified to determine whether the shoe is the result of coyote scavenging?
I think that mischaracterizes what Your Honor has been doing this morning.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to understand the distinction between...
He's trying to make an argument in front of the
One of you
jury.
talk at a time, and it's not your turn, is it? Go ahead.
I'm trying to understand the distinction between everything else we've heard about coyote scavenging from the doctor, and now why suddenly the doctor is saying he can't talk about the sock, and it's not relevant to what he has to say.
Well, the relevance is my determination, so he shouldn't be making that objection because he can't make objections.
Yes, Your Honor.
He just stated, I forgot what you just said. Look, hold on. Okay. He did state that there are many times socks have been chewed through as part of what he's done. So I'm going to allow him to answer. Well, let me hear your question. I think I'm going to allow it to happen. But I didn't let you finish your record. I'm sorry, Mr. Bogan.
The witness has already testified what his expertise lies in, what he can testify to, and this is beyond the scope of direct.
I don't think it's necessarily beyond the scope in terms of what you're trying to show with this witness. There was a lot of testimony on direct about the ability of a coyote to take a skull at considerable distance, which is an issue in this case. So, ask your question again.
I'm going to put 312 on the screen, or excuse me, 312 on the screen. Doctor, you can either look on the screen or you can look for the sock in front of you. Any indication that the sock was chewed on by a coyote?
No.
Would you agree that the best person to analyze the remains of Dylan Redwine would be a forensic anthropologist who works in Colorado?
I would agree that the best person to examine the remains that are found locally is a board-certified forensic anthropologist.
And fair to say then that when it comes to forensic anthropology, forensic anthropologists should stick to the area they are trained or worked in and defer to others who work in other different environments. Is that fair to say?
It's not fair to say.
Do you recall making that statement?
I'm sorry?
Do you recall making that statement yourself to investigate a Heidel?
I don't. You'd have to read me the transcript.
Would it be fair to say that you would defer to your colleagues who might have more experience in the type of environment we have here in Colorado?
I don't think there's an anthropologist in Colorado and maybe in the country that has seen animals, coyote scavenging of human beings more than I have. So I don't think there is a single expert that could say, no, Anderson, no, you're wrong. I think I have as much expertise as any board-certified forensic anthropologist in this country to look at skeletal remains and infer scavenging, canid scavenging versus vulture scavenging, and then amongst canids, speculate as to whether it's a dog or a coyote. I don't think any local anthropologist in this country has more experience in that than I do.
Certainly you have your opinion, doctor, and you've done a lot of work, particularly in the desert area where bodies have been found. But are you disagreeing with your statement that it would be wise to let the person who is familiar with working in this environment give the opinion?
Asked and answered.
No, he didn't answer it. He wanted to know where he wanted it read to him, I think, and that's just what happened.
I believe that for my own job. I believe that I and my two colleagues, because we have more experience in what happens in southern Arizona, we ought to be the people that examine the first choice of the people that examine bodies, skeletons found in southern Arizona. So I would agree with that.
Would you also agree, doctor, that animal scavengers don't take the backpack from someone who's deceased that they're feeding on?
Boy, that's a new one on me. I have no idea what scavengers do with backpacks.
Do you agree with me that scavengers don't open the backpack and take the clothing from within the backpack?
I won't agree with you with that because I don't have any idea what animals do with backpacks.
In the times you described on direct where you're in a helicopter and you're following the coyotes around and you're doing all this work, have you ever seen them carrying a backpack as they run away from the human body?
No.
Have you ever seen a scavenger or known a scavenger to take someone's cell phone away from their body?
This font of questions has been asked and answered, Judge. You could go through a whole litany of like...
You know, it sounds familiar, though, doesn't it, Mr. Bogan? And I didn't like it when you did it either. So you can ask that a different way, I think, and then be done with it.
Have you ever known animal scavengers to take the personal effects of an individual, including, for example, backpack, clothing, cell phone, and debit card?
The court just sustained an objection to this question.
No, I said he could ask it a different way. One question is fine. The answer was yes. There may be some follow-up now.
So you've known scavengers, you've seen scavengers take backpacks away from and run a great distance from where a person has died?
That's not the question you asked, Counselor. I have seen backpacks torn open, presumably by the carnivore. Maybe there was food in there. Who knows? We have seen pack rats and other small mammals take wristwatches and probably, yes, Counselor, cell phones, maybe because they're shiny, but they remove these items, these shiny items, and take them 10 yards, 20 yards, 100 yards away from the death site to their burrows.
Have you, in your experience, seen them remove those objects? Actually seen this, Doctor, from the entire area?
So you're asking me if I was present when the animal scavenged?
You said yes, you've seen animals take items away. And I'm asking, when you see the animals taking items away, have you seen them take them all the way away, just gone? I'm asking you a question based on what you just said. What did you see?
No, I usually am not present where the body is found.
Your Honor, I have nothing further. Thank you.
All right, how long is your redirect going to be?
Probably 20 to 30, Judge.
Well, then we'll take a recess. Okay?
We'll start up again at 10 after. Thank you. Everybody rise, adjourned. I will. Okay, I'll be in recess.
And I take it the witness can step down and go, yeah.
What time was that, Judge? 10 after. It's pretty rare I'm the calmest one in the room, so it's okay. Judge, can I get some fresh air? Yeah, I'll just be back at 10 after.